So we're just lingering over these opening verses in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. There's this extraordinary moment where Solomon is repenting of his worship. And we're not even talking here about the idolatrous worship that we know he engaged in later in life. We're thinking here about his involvement in what we might think of as the authentic worship of the ancient church, the worship that was rooted in the temple, with everything that pointed towards in terms of the coming of the Messiah. But looking back, even considering his involvement in that worship in the temple, he realizes that one of the big mistakes that he made throughout his life, and that he came with him even into the kind of the holy ground of worship, if I can put it like that. One of the big mistakes was his pride and his arrogance. That meant that he was more concerned with himself, with what he was saying, than he was with what God had to say. It's a subtle mistake, but it's an easy one to make. That our focus, even in worship, is on ourselves rather than on the Lord. And it's not just that that's an easier mistake to make than we might realize. It's actually a far more serious mistake to make than we might realize. In the Bible, approaching God is seen as this colossally dangerous thing to do. At the end of Exodus, there's this moment where the glory of God is made manifest in the temple. And it just says like everybody is driven out of the presence of God. Even Moses wasn't able to cross the threshold of the temple, of the tabernacle, and to come into the presence of the living God. And then you turn the page into Leviticus chapter 1. And there's this beautiful, beautiful moment when the Lord calls out to Moses from the tent of meeting. See, he's graciously forged this way by which his people can come back into his presence, can draw near even to the manifest glory that we see at the end of Exodus. But it's very specific and it's very precise. And there is a long list of people who sought to come into the presence of God in a way that they thought was appropriate. Or once they were in the presence of God, they said and did things that they thought were appropriate, but actually they weren't. And they paid for their presumption with their life. Think of Nadab or Abihu or Uzzah. It just gives you a sense that what we say and do in worship really, really matters. The fact of God's grace to us in Jesus, and the fact that means that generally we are protected from the consequences of our folly and our presumption in worship. The fact of God's grace to us doesn't minimize the seriousness and the significance of what we say and do when we come before the living God. We tend not to die when we do the wrong things, or even do the right things in the wrong way. But God's grace shouldn't blind us to the reality of the situation. And it's a situation that requires him to be gracious in the first place. That it's dangerous for us to come before the presence of the living God. We're sinners coming before a holy God. We are creatures of dust coming before our Creator and our Sustainer, the one on whom we depend for every breath. We are coming before one who invites us to call him Father, absolutely. But as our Father, he remains the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, whose majesty, whose splendor stretches out through the eternity of everlasting ages, whose glory cannot even be contained by the highest heavens. We come before the throne of the one before whom countless millions of angels fall on their faces and cry, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come." The one who is glorified as the creator of all things, by whose will everything has its being. The one to whom all praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength are to be attributed for everlasting ages. See, the intimacy of the relationship that we enjoy with that God through Jesus doesn't change the reality that it is that God who invites us to be in intimate relationship with him. We often use the fact that we're invited to call God our Father as an excuse to sort of cultivate it's almost like a studied casualness in our worship. But when we see the church in heaven, the church glorified, a church that actually understands the dynamics of their relationship with God far better than we do yet, a church that understands what it means to speak of God as Father far better than we do. When we see the church in heaven, they are generally falling on their faces along with the rest of the multitude of heaven. They're not pretending an affected intimacy as if being able to speak of God as Father means that we can approach him without needing to worry about things like reverence and awe. And looking back on life as an old man, Solomon dearly wishes that he had been a lot more mindful of this as he had come to worship Sabbath by Sabbath than in fact he was. And as he reflects on this now as an old man getting ready to step into eternity, to meet his God, the lesson that he's learned that he wants to pass on to us is guard your steps when you go near to the house of God. Just think carefully. Consider the reality of this situation that you're stepping into as you approach the worship of the living God with the people of God. What does he say? God is in heaven. You are on earth. All right? And the application of that observation is, let your words be few. It's not a plea for silence in worship services. He's not saying, don't sing, don't speak. It is a plea, though, to recognize the reality of the situation that we are in when we are at worship and to respond to that situation appropriately. Whatever the style of our services, they need to be marked by this deep humility that is more concerned with what God is saying to us than with what we are saying to God. That there is a carefulness about what we're doing and what we are saying. See, Jesus tells us that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken. And Solomon warns us that that's as true when we gather for worship as it is for the rest of life. See, when we stop and think of what it means to say that our God is in heaven, we can begin to appreciate why what we say when we come before that God really, really does matter.